And every generation has a responsibility at least to pass on the good that they've received. And sometimes, if that generation should come about after a time of neglect and rupture, it may have a responsibility to recover and to transmit things that have maybe skipped a generation or two.
Hello and welcome to the Reframing Education podcast, the show exploring education with Christ at the centre. My name is Will Mortimer.
And I'm Johnny Thomas, and the focus for today's episode, the importance of the past, and we're delighted to be joined by Dr. Brian Lapsa. So Brian, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really honored to be here.
Brian, you're the Director of UK and European Operations for Memoria Press and a General Editor at Mount Titano, bringing European classic texts into the modern day. You've taught philosophy and Latin and Greek and history and literature at the universities of Leiden and Oxford, at Memoria College and in Riga, and you're also a research fellow in ancient history at the University of Latvia, which is a country where you have deep family roots and you now live. So you're someone coming to this conversation with a broad and a rich experience in education and real historical and philosophical depth to your own thinking. So we're delighted to have you with us. But we're not all academics or classicists. So whether we're listening as a parent or a teacher or a school or church leader, what is it that all of us can gain looking back at the past as we think about education in the present and for the future?
Well, that's a great question. And I think one of the first things when we're thinking about education reform is that there's so much pressure in school and out of school and private life and public life to be original, be new, or sometimes we say true to yourself, creative. And there's also to be said for some kind of true originality and creativity. But it puts a huge burden of pressure on us. And really for that to work, for the creativity to be successful, I would say it should be grounded somewhere. It needs to be grounded in a word, in a tradition. And that's not to be a slave to it, but that's so that you have some kind of stable basis to stand on. So looking back gives us some kind of depth, gives us some kind of foundation, I would say.
Wonderful, thank you. And as we think particularly about challenges and opportunities within the UK education system, I wonder if, as a historian, you can think of one or two of the greatest lessons from the past that could teach us today.
Yeah, well, that's another good question. One of the things that's striking in looking at the broader educational tradition is that you have some kinds of enduring ideals. So I would say, for instance, we look at the Roman educational tradition. One of the slogans that echoed through the centuries was from Cato the Elder. And he had a formula with which he described the ideal of not just Roman education, but also Roman society. And that was the vir bonus dicendi peritus, or the good man who's skilled at speaking. And there you have a twofold definition, I suppose. On the one hand, you have some vision of technical excellence in the Roman terms of the day, expressed in terms of the skill in speaking, and also moral excellence. And just the candor with which authors from even before Cato, through his time, through the empire, through the Middle Ages and beyond, were willing to speak both about technical excellence on the one hand and moral excellence as really being two parts of what it means to be fully educated is, I think, one important lesson from the past. Another sort of institutional lesson from the past that I think could be particularly useful today would be just the sense of decentralization, you might say. So it's pretty rare in history to find a total state monopoly, for instance, on education, or a very, very heavily policed, non-monopolized independent sector. And I know that may touch a few nerves at the moment in the UK, but it's actually very encouraging, inspiring in some ways, not to be a unreflective admirer of the Roman Empire by any means, but for all that we admire in Roman education, there's never a Roman education system. There's no Ministry of Education. There's no school system really, except other than as supported at the very local level. And the few attempts that we see to make one backfire pretty spectacularly. So that's maybe another lesson from antiquity.
You've talked about the strengths in the Roman education as being this pairing of technical excellence and moral excellence, but then also the lack of a centralized system, if you like. bringing it forward to today and the UK, the modern situation, are there any practical ways in which that could manifest itself in the UK classrooms? Do you think those ideas?
Well, absolutely. So maybe we can drill down a little bit more into what I mean by that technical excellence, moral excellence, how it reflected, or how the Greco-Roman mind approached both of these things. So they had a view of what literary formation could do for the character, which is, I think, a little bit remote to us. And one of the things that's striking is the emphasis they place on memorization. We'll come back to this in a technical key, but first in a moral key. There's a real sense that if you made vast amounts of excellent poetry, in particular epic poetry, part of your mental furniture, this could actually help you become a better person. It's a pretty bold claim. It's probably not always true, but there's something to be said for it. And the reason for it is pretty striking, and may be able to help us in some ways. So there's a line from, going up to the Greek side of antiquity, from Xenophon, in which one of his characters is describing his own education. And he talks about how when he was a boy, his father made him memorize the entirety of the Iliad and the Odyssey. It's tens of thousands of lines of Greek poetry, precisely because he was anxious, he says, to see me develop into a good man. So this deep exposure, not just once through reading or telling them the story, important as those were as starting points, but a really protracted and deep exposure to the text was meant to instill in this boy what was needed to make him be a good and successful Greek. And on the technical side, there's an analogy which I like to point to, which seems to be very clear in antiquity, Middle Ages, early modernity, and that's the analogy of an apprenticeship model. So you have a master who knows something very thoroughly and is slowly, step by step, introducing the apprentices. And there's a pretty clear process that's at work there. The presentation of a model of something well done. There's an attempt to repeat what's been done to create that model. There's memorization of the process, the successful imitation, even a kind of competition with that model. And then finally you branch out and maybe you create something new. And that model, I think, it's not just, let's say, blacksmithing or carpentry or something like that, but in the fields that I see that are very successful today, there's a lot of the same thing that goes on. And just the most evident to me would be musical performance and sport. And you think of someone who becomes a solo pianist. That brilliant performance that you see on stage is at the back of uh, 10, 20, 30, 40 years in which there's a daily drill that's gone through and a lot more scales than probably any of those musicians wanted to perform in the first place. And um, and and a repetition of the piece that's performed, and mastery of the basics before variations are attempted. And likewise with sport. So how many penalty kicks does a footballer take before he reaches the level that he's competing in the World Cup at the moment, for instance? How many times do you practice your dribbling drills and even just basic sprinting drills? All of these sorts of things are principles that we know have to be done, because the result is very clear. And even those of us who aren't expert musicians or expert athletes know when somebody has done it well and has gone through those races. And we just don't do anything like that anymore, largely speaking, in the humanities, in literature and history. And to my mind, that's one of the great lessons of ancient, medieval, early modern education, is that it was very clear, it was almost blindingly obvious that this is the sort of thing that you had to do if you wanted really to learn something to mastery, by which I mean in the literal sense of learning to the point where you can then teach it, you can then be the transmitter.
Thank you, Brian. That's a really helpful analogy, bringing some of the rigor and the discipline and the drilling, really, of the sports and arts into the world of the humanities, where perhaps that we need a little bit more of that.
To take a further analogy, the way that I think of the value of studying the past sometimes, imagine it's Christmas. You've probably had the experience of receiving a Christmas present from someone you love, which is not just purchased, however nice the purchase presents may be, but something they've made. Maybe it's a painting, maybe it's a scarf, maybe it's a homemade cake. It's clear that it took some skill and took some time, love, care, and all the rest. And what can you do with that is upon receiving it, you can choose not to open it at all, which would be it's one thing that you can do, just leave it off to the side. You can open it, say something polite, and then just leave it on the side. Or you can open it, spend some time with it, and at least try to enjoy it. Maybe you really will enjoy it. But maybe you don't. And you also don't have to hang the painting on the wall or wear the scarf every day, but you should at least know something about what it is. And in that, there's a whole cultivation of a disposition, I would say. And if I were to put one word on it, it's piety. Not necessarily in the modern sense of a religious reverence or something approaching prayer, but having a disposition of gratitude and respect towards that which has been received. And in a way, I think we could think of all of our individual existence, our family existences, our communal existences, national existences as a kind of very, very beautiful Christmas gift, long in the coming, filtered through our families, through previous generations, ultimately from God, and sure, maybe a little damaged in the process or in the post, but basically is a kind of gift with which we should become familiar. And so this old Greco-Roman ideal of internalizing vast amounts of the literary side of that patrimony, on the one hand, cultivates that disposition towards something like piety, and on the other hand, ideally instills a whole raft of other virtues associated with the characters who are found in that poetry.
That's this position of looking back with humility and receiving from the past as if one is receiving a gift. You mentioned the role of memorization in that, and UK education has something of a tortured relationship with memorization. I was struck in church history, to be a bishop in the early church, one had to know by heart all 150 psalms to be considered for that role, which is a wonderful thought of the internalization of that which can bless us and through us bless others as well. Brian, just to return you to your that quotation you gave us of the good man skilled at speaking.
Mm-hmm.
If you were giving a one-line definition of what education is for, would that be one that you would reach for? Has your own thinking developed over the years on this question, or
that formula definitely would influence the way I would define education. I would say that, and I'll define it in terms of its goals, I suppose. What does any education try to do? In my opinion, it shapes the mind, it shapes the character, and it shapes the nature of cultural transmission. Or even to rephrase that, shapes the mind, shapes the character, and it transmits a certain sort of culture. And I think that's true of what we might call a classical educational tradition, which does so very consciously, but I think it's true of any form of education, even those forms that I would not particularly agree with. There's a certain vision of what it means to have a well-formed mind. The same with moral education. It's not every school that will use the language of virtues and vices in the way that the contemporary classical education movement does, but there will be some implicit sense of what is the right kind of value set, and values would be the term that they prefer to use very often instead of virtues or vices. And likewise, there is a certain sort of culture, by which I mean a set of practices and a set of knowledge that is being transmitted by any education. And that's a point. That last point is one that I think we often forget. So we like to talk, even, I mean, within a classical education world in which I spend most of my time now, there's a lot of emphasis on how to think, learning how to think. There's a lot of emphasis on being good men and women as our goal, and that's already a lot. But it was the late Sir Roger Scruton who encouraged a bit of development, and I suppose my thinking about this in a book of his called Culture Counts. And he said there is such a thing, more or less, I'm paraphrasing, but he said there is such a thing as being too focused on the personal formation. He emphasized that we're only ever a few years away from a total civilizational rupture. And that rupture can happen through a cataclysm, that can happen through war or some sort of natural disaster, but it can also happen just through negligence. And every generation has a responsibility at least to pass on the good that they've received. And sometimes if that generation should come about after a time of neglect and rupture, it may have a responsibility to recover and to transmit things that have maybe skipped a generation or two.
Perhaps that's an example of where the individualism, the atomization of our culture kind of seeps into our thinking without us even realizing it, and recognizing that actually education is not only about forming the individual, but connecting us in our communities at that moment, but also rooting us with those that came before us and passing something on to those that came after us. That's really interesting. Brian, we have a standing question on the show of the good book and a good book, where we ask guests if there's a particular passage of scripture that has influenced their own thinking about education, or particular book that they'd like to draw to the attention of our listeners. So, the good book, over to you.
Yeah, and I like this question. And the few that came to mind, just in thinking of this, preparing, meditating on on what I might say here, would be there's a chapter of Hebrews which I ended up using a fair amount in my own dissertation, and that's Hebrews 11, where there's a list of what you could call heroes of faith, and the author runs from Abraham through some of the standards that you might expect,
Mm.
Joseph and Moses and so on. But there are a few that are a little bit surprising in there as well. So Rahab, for instance, she ends up being a real heroine of faith. Jephthah also, that whole episode of Judges is very, very strange. And I find it, I see that as an invitation through what can sometimes be, particularly on the question of exemplars, a tendency to reduce people to a kind of two-dimensional cardboard uh, cutout of of what it means to be virtuous. So Abraham, faith. Joseph, he had faith. Moses, he had faith. But there's a whole internal life behind all of these
Mm.
figures, which is just as rich and dynamic as the sorts of lives that we see in our friends and loved ones around us, and the ones that we experience ourselves today. And the kind of jarring inclusion of a few of those names, like Rahab and Jephthah, remind us that actually that's true of everyone else in the list as well. Abraham,
Mm.
not a straightforward guy. Joseph also, Moses too. So I like the way that chapter in particular just pulls me in, and I don't know, vistas seem to open there. And I think at its best, the literary and historical education will, yes, of course, and emphasized memorization earlier in our conversation, will include rattling off the a certain amount of rattling off the facts, and learning who is who and where. But behind each of those names is a whole world, really. So those would be the passages from the good book.
That's wonderful. It's so encouraging. And a good book?
Yeah, so a good book, one that I read, I think 2 years ago, but which comes to mind very frequently when I'm either talking with schools or homeschooling parents or just thinking about education, is Tom Brown's School Days by
Mm.
Thomas Hughes, and that's a mid-19th century book. It's it's a novel, but it's largely autobiographical, and it's something of a memoir of this man Thomas Hughes' days at rugby school at a time when Thomas Arnold had just become headmaster. A lot of Thomases involved. There's Thomas Arnold, Thomas Hughes, and Tom Brown. He could have been a little bit more creative on the name, but it's a really beautiful depiction of some of what was best, I would say, in
Mm.
the English public schooling tradition. That tradition is not a monolith. We're in the process of recovering, and we shouldn't think that we even want to recover everything that was
Mm.
in the past, even at any one particular time. And Thomas Arnold was faced with something similar when he came to rugby school, which had been a bit in a period of decline, bit of crisis, and academic standards were sort of hoops to be jumped through. There was a lot of indifference, even a lot of cheating. And out of very Christian concerns, he wanted to bring back, you could say, to lean on the Cato, the elder formula again. He wanted to bring back the vir bonus side, the good man side of education, informed by Christian revelation and a sort of Christian set of virtues. And he went about that reform very gently but very firmly as well. And for the image of a boyhood in the early part of the 19th century, in particular, if you're going to go out and look for this book, get the edition that's not abridged. Then you have a beautiful description of basically a poem in prose, almost a love letter to the valley that Tom Hughes grew up
Mm.
in, and then the account of life at school. So in terms of stimulating the imagination for what, think of what was maybe at its best and what could be. Tom Brown's School Days be my recommendation.
Wonderful. Thank you. You mentioned the best of the English public school system, and that we would be wise perhaps to recover some of those elements, but not all of them. So what are the elements that you would particularly want to recover and think that we'd be wise to recover? And what are the elements that we'd be wise to say, actually, they can stay in the past?
Sure. It's a great question. So on the positive side, I would say there wasn't much bashfulness about a certain degree of patriotism. It's okay to to love your country. There was a really deep encounter with the literary greats of particularly of Greece and Rome, and I think that the classical education movement today has done an excellent job of putting those back on the table as desirable goals. But I think we have a long way to go in terms of really embracing the canon and understanding it. There are a few works which tend to figure prominently from Greek and Latin antiquity in many classical schools. But if we were to compare them to what they're doing in rugby of the 19th century, then I think we'd see that there's a ways to go. Just on the patriotism point, I was struck by an article I just came across recently, but it's from about 15 years ago, which emphasized a rather startling lack of knowledge of the history of Britain. So this is back 15 years ago. 2/3 of Britain's undergraduates, so university students, didn't know who was monarch at the time of the Armada. About as many didn't know where the Boer War took place, and so on. It doesn't get much better from there. And that I read in connection with a couple of recent studies. The numbers are so wildly off, I'm not really sure if they can be trusted. But one last year suggested that of Britons between 18 and 27, only about 11% would be willing to fight for Britain. This year, there was another study which is somewhat more encouraging, I suppose, which said that under some circumstances, 38% said that they would fight. But the 2 points are connected: the lack of historical awareness, and then the lack of the love of one's own place. And those are not problems generally that school children in the 19th century had. There are blind spots as well. There's a kind of rah imperialism, which in some ways led to things that we're not so keen on repeating today, and those are also well covered and so constantly emphasized that probably we don't need to go into them. And then there's also, just in institutional terms, remember that these sorts of schools tended to be boarding schools, and families will feel very differently about this. But 11 is a pretty young and tender age to go abroad or to leave one's home. And I think probably the most eloquent criticism of this comes in C.S. Lewis's Surprised by Joy, where he remembers some very unhappy years at the boarding school that he attended, and remembers a lot of different kinds of abuse. But one of the words he said was the kind of sadistic treatment of younger boys by some of the older boys, and so that's obviously something which we don't want or need to repeat.
And those who work in boarding environments will have recognised that it's chalk and cheese how the environment today is from many decades ago. We'll perhaps leave it for another day, the question of whether you would bring back bare knuckle boxing between the boys, Brian, to solve to solve disputes, and boys being plied with brandy between rounds as the masters watched on, and that's for another day. One aspect, Brian, that I know that you do feel very passionate about and love to see recovered is your love of classical languages. You've recently begun to teach Latin at the Veterum Sapientia Institute, which exists to help those wanting to develop a richer understanding of their Catholic heritage. And you've also taught Latin and Greek at Oxford University, where you helped launch Oxford Latinitas. Tell us just a little bit why Latin, and particularly what is meant by the active method, which I know is something that you are very positive about.
Yeah, that's right. That's a whole kettle of fish, but I'll be brief. I would say that if I can paraphrase Eliot, in our beginning is our end to some extent, and we look back to Greece and to Rome because they contain much of the seed that was to flourish throughout the rest of Western history, which by now has become has become world history.
Mm.
And as for the languages, they're expressions of the word, and they're those two languages in particular are rich, inexhaustible reflections of the word as refracted through the societies that gave us, for many centuries, virtually all the genres of literature that we have. Gave us philosophy, scientific inquiry, law. Almost no field was untouched by them, and the proof of that is to be seen in the almost exclusive monopoly that Greek and Latin have in technical fields in all languages today. But for learning the language, instead of just relying on things in translation or memorizing short lists, it's because there's a whole thought world there. There's a whole sympathy which is possible when one has access through the language to the original text. Is it going to be possible for everyone to attain a total mastery of these? Perhaps not, but we need some who can, and it's a good thing for many people to have a lot, and to have really to have many amateurs in the true sense of those who love something.
Hmm.
And so then to the question, why active, it's certainly not so that it would be something like a party trick or say something in Latin. No, the idea is that when it's done responsibly, it isn't always, but when it's done responsibly, and there are many excellent examples of this now, it can be the most effective way, I would say, of going deep and doing that with some sort of speed. It's the way people learn French. Involving the organs of the mouth, of the vocal cords, of the ears, is a way of having those words sit not just in the eyes and on the pages of the paper, but really becoming a part of of our mental apparatus. And there are various studies that support this method of learning. An analogy I sometimes use is that when one immigrates from one country to another, uh, one does well to learn the local language,
Mm.
or as I experienced when I was living in the United Kingdom, having come from the US, to learn aspects of the local idiom and aspects of local linguistic culture. And once one does that, then one really can participate in life in local life in a way that's not possible if one has even just the languages in a sort of literary way. You can talk to people. You can be spoken to by people. You can enter into a relationship with them in a way that's otherwise not possible. So I think something similar can be applied to our exploits, trying to get to know these two civilizations that contain within them much of the seed of the culture that we've inherited. And even when doing the active method, I should emphasize that there ought to be a strongly grammatical component. If it's done by a competent teacher, it can be done also in the target language.
So the active method, Brian, sounds like in microcosm an expression of your vision of education as being for the whole person: mind, heart, will, body, mouth, ears,
Mm.
and we'll include some links to some of those opportunities in the show notes below, so people can follow those
Yeah.
up, because I know a number of them are accessible online and not just in person. So
That's right. Yeah. Well, thank you.
Brian, you mentioned that it's good for there to be some who have mastery over Latin, but not all. But it's desirable that there would be lots of amateurs, by which you mean people who love Latin. And when I sometimes speak to people about classical education in particular, Latin seems to be a bit of a word that maybe injects a bit of fear into people's minds, or fear, or maybe even a bit of confusion, or why. So I just wonder what would you say to quell those fears and encourage a bit of love for Latin?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I'll answer by drawing on Tolkien. Somewhere he says that the best reason for learning a language is its beauty. And as far as languages go, Latin is very beautiful. But it also happens to be this, you could almost see it as a lifeblood that flows through Western cultural history. I mean, it's just everywhere, and only something like 10 to 20% of the texts that were ever written in Latin have been translated into a major modern vernacular language, including English. So there's a vast quantity of it. It's the language in which not only much of the Greek patrimony came to the West, but also through which much of theology, particularly Western theology, of course, was articulated. And that begins very early in the 2nd century and is carried through well into the Reformation and beyond. So, for instance, there were epic poems being written according to the old received standards about the Gospels. So there's an epic poem of the life of Christ, which we have from the 4th century already. But that tradition continued. People kept writing Latin epic poetry and up into the 20th century. And so there's an epic Latin poem, perhaps not so surprisingly, of, let's say, a Counter-Reformation hero like Ignatius of Loyola. But you might not know that there's also a Latin epic poem about the life of Luther. And there's Latin poetry through the 19th century on all kinds of things: celebrations of visits of monarchs, retirements of headmasters, congratulations, birthday poems. There were several Latin newspapers in the 20th century produced in Italy and in Hungary. So it's a kind of linguistic framework that embraces so much of Western history. It's a whole country. It's a country in which there you could say there's a pagan sector of the country. There's a Christian sector of the country which has some border disputes, but it's rich. It's inexhaustible. And I think in terms of if what we're interested in, at least in part in education, is a participation in a tradition, then there's no way, certainly in the West, and I think there'll be a few missing premises to fill in, but there's a good claim for Latin to be the most universal of the classical languages worldwide.
I find that fascinating, Brian. You mentioned Luther there, and Luther and others encouraged to move away from Latin in the name of accessibility, but you're showing things in a slightly different angle there of actually a recovery of Latin in its own way in the name of accessibility, so that people can access technical riches in the present, but also reach back into the past to access a richness of writing. And that's some of what you're doing as your role as general editor of opening up these works that are lying dormant and unread.
Yes, and it's not just about technical expertise in the present, but also but a living participation in the present. We can, I have friends, for instance, one friend in Chile, another in Ireland, others elsewhere, with whom I communicate primarily in Latin, and it's a way of escaping the exigencies, I suppose, of whatever contemporary empire, cultural or otherwise, happens to exist. You could make a good claim for French or Spanish or especially now English, Arabic or Chinese being the language that we ought to learn and then and be able to communicate with each other. But relying on the language, not the dead language, the living language of a dead empire, is a way of stepping out of contemporary geopolitical, geocultural concerns and meeting on a kind of equal playing field. So.
And as a universal language for a global church as well, that was very much the view and remains the view for many.
Thank you, Brian, so much. It's been wonderful having you, and we'd love to carry on, but all things must come to an end. So I'll just say thank you very much for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. It's been a pleasure to be here.
And thank you all for listening to this episode of Reframing Education. We exist to open up conversation about Christ-centered education in the UK. We host fortnightly interviews to inspire and equip educators, parents, and leaders as we explore the big question: what is the purpose of education?
Follow, like, share, leave a review. It all helps grow the conversation. And check out the show notes for other ways to support and connect. Thank you for listening. And until next time, may God fill education with the colour of Christ as we're drawn to the praise and love of our Creator.
Amen.